The reason we're here is to talk about the film you've chosen as your favourite, which is Full Metal Jacket. So I was just wondering if you could tell me a little bit about how you first came across that film, how you first interacted with it, and why you've chosen it to talk about.
So my first interaction with Full Metal Jacket, I reckon, because I think it's like an 18 certificate movie, and it came out in about 1985.
Yeah,
possibly.
late. Yeah, it's
so I was so I was too young to see it at the cinema. So my first encounter with Full Metal Jacket, I believe, would have been on VHS, and I think it's sort of in those days the movies would come out a couple of years later on VHS, and I would have gone into my local newsagents and paid $2.99, and I would have watched it on the miracle of picture quality that was a VHS tape. But I just remember, and I also think quite significantly, it was probably the first Stanley Kubrick film that I've ever seen, and I'm a huge Stanley Kubrick fan. Even the Kubrick films that a lot of other people don't like, I'm usually a pretty big fan of. So it was kind of an introduction, and it just felt really different and really fresh. And I think everyone with Full Metal Jacket, it's very much a movie of two halves. The first half with all the training sequences, and the second half that's actually set in Vietnam. And a lot of people see that as a weakness, but I kind of see it as actually being a really interesting way to structure a movie, and it's always fun to do something different. But I just remember the dialogue in those opening sections just being funny and sharp and engaging, and it just sort of hooked me in a way, that movie.
Yeah, I mean, you alluded to it there, which was kind of the thing I wanted to bring up. It's very much a film of two halves. The problem I've always had with it, and the problem I had when I watched it again this morning, is that first half is so terrific. I think that first sort of opening hour might be the best thing Kubrick's ever done. And I count Clockwork Orange as one of my favourite films. But that second half always feels like a drop-off in quality for me. Like, it's strong still, but it's never as strong as that opening. You're
absolutely right. You've got half of like an A-star movie tacked onto sort of half of a B movie. The second, well, not B movie in the sense of a B movie, in the sense of a B grade movie. You know, I'm getting tangled up here. You people know what I mean. So I mean, actually, it's a really interesting point that kind of disjointed structure creates the opportunity for that, but. I still think it holds up overall as a movie, and I've done it a couple of times, especially recently when Robert Lee Ermey died, and I was thinking to myself, I'm just going to watch the first half of Full Metal Jacket, just the bit that he's in, because I just want to remind it, because that bit I always enjoy. But actually, whenever I watch it, it's still good enough that I nearly always carry on and watch the whole movie. I don't think I've ever actually just watched half of it.
Yeah, it almost becomes a completely different movie. It's like that first half is such a sort of self-contained thriller, and then the second half is like it's a war movie in the sense that it's about war as much as it depicts it. Yeah. I find it strange watching it as a British person, because obviously the Vietnam thing is such a political bone of contention in America. Do you think there's a difference between the way we see it and the way an American would see it?
I mean, I guess so. I've got no more insight into that than anyone else, but I mean, it's always going to be a more personal experience, and it's always like the thing when you go abroad and, someone will slag off their own country, say, when you're in Australia, Australia's a dump, Australia's a terrible place, Australia's blah, blah, blah. But then if I, as a POM, am in Australia and I make a disrespectful comment about Australia, they all sort of jump down your throat and leap on you. And so I guess probably with the Vietnam War, there are sort of sensitivities in America that aren't in place, that aren't in place in the UK. But it's hard to judge, and it's such a big generational gap. I actually met my first ever Vietnam vet when I've probably met others before, but who was open about it. I actually picked up an Uber when I was in Las Vegas last year, and it was so funny because some of the people who drive Ubers in America, they're all quite elderly people, because they still have cars and they just do it to earn a bit of extra money. And it was really fascinating just talking to this sort of Vietnam vet who'd moved to Las Vegas and now drives an Uber car, and he was telling me about his, time in the sort of basically almost World War I style trench warfare, and, just how horrific it was. And it just sounded quite strange coming out of this elderly American guy sitting in a air-conditioned Toyota pickup that was taking me for an Uber ride,
Yeah, it's strange, and I think one of the things that's interesting about that second half is the way Joker's positioned, in that, so he has, one of the first things he says in the entire movie is, "I'm here to kill," and then he's wearing the peace symbol on his outfit, and he actually says, maybe I'm trying to make a point about the duality of man. Do you think that the film kind of has a viewpoint in that respect, or is it as confused as Joker almost seems to be?
I mean, I think You don't really get it from the movie, but I get it more from knowing what I know about Kubrick, having read biographies and things like that, was that he was a man who would obsess over every little detail in a movie. And I think that's really significant, because I think, you know, as a writer, when I obsess over everything and fuss over every little detail, quite often what I end up with is something that's a bit of a mess and a bit incoherent. Whereas the thing that I write quite quickly isn't necessarily as well thought through, but is often more coherent. So I think it's always the case with Kubrick's movies that the messages are a bit mixed and a bit confused and have to be unpicked a little bit.
And so you've sort of alluded to this already. How significant is Kubrick for you? So for me, I credit a lot of my interest in films to watching Kubrick movies. So I kind of watched The Shining and A Clockwork Orange in quick succession, and that was sort of the point at which I went, I want to write about films. That's what I'm interested in. How significant was Kubrick for you?
I mean, obviously I didn't end up in films, but I mean, when I just look
despite 12 years of Cherub development, when I end up in I've totally forgotten the question now. Your rampant sarcasm was completely throwing me off the track. Yeah, I mean, it's just about how people structure stories, and I mean, Full Metal Jacket's a good example, because so many war movies are just so damn cheesy, and you watch it, and I think there's a Mel Gibson one that I really loathe called We Were Heroes, and he's basically, I think it's We Were Heroes, and he's the clean-cut American guy, and he fights the war, and you know he's going to win at the end, and he does win at the end, and the movie just sort of happens, and things get blown up, but there's not a single interesting thing in the movie. There's nothing that really engages you emotionally. You always know what's going to happen, and that's one of the things, you know, a lot of war movies just very easily fall into cliche, and I think that's what Kubrick never does. So you alluded to Robert Muchamore early on. One of the things about the film that gets so much praise is his performance, and particularly given his real world experience. How important is he to the film, and particularly in the way he sort of prevents it from disappearing into cliche, as that role easily could have been?
It's interesting, isn't it? And the role is so iconic that a lot of what he does now is cliche, but I think at the time it would have come out, it wasn't. But yeah, I mean, I think, you know, as a writer, you know, even just writing a book where I have control over so much, there's still an enormous role of luck, you know, just in what works, what doesn't work, whether you're hitting the market at the right time. And with a film, one of the things I actually did when I was writing my Rockwell books and I was interested in TV production was I just went on a couple of TV sets and low-budget film sets. And what you realise, you know, you read these books about the auteur director and how much control they have and how important everything is. And when you're actually on a film set, it's like, oh my God, we've got to do this shot, the camera's broken, we've got 15 minutes until tea break, no one's eaten for 3 days. And there are just so many other pressures that inevitably a lot of what happens in a film and whether something works or not is down to luck. So, you know, just casting an actor who is right is, you know, yeah, there's a degree of skill in it, and but it's also partly luck.
So to stick with Ermi, one of the things you've mentioned when we were speaking prior to this, you mentioned it, and I'm sure I remember you mentioning it in the past, is his significance to Cherub and the instructor characters in Cherub. I was wondering if you could talk about that a little bit as a sort of side note.
Yes, I mean, in the Cherub books, there's this basically evil, mean, horrible training instructor called Mr. Norman Large, and he is basically based, a lot of his dialogue and the stuff that he does is based on the I've forgotten the name of the damn character now, but he's based on the training instructor in Full Metal Jacket. And there are a few others that are in it as well. There's like the Clint Eastwood character in Heartbreak Ridge and some of the stuff that happens in An Officer and a Gentleman and things like that. But I just think he's so good at what he does. Like, how could anyone ever write a tough training instructor and not refer to that character? I think it's just impossible to do. I mean, one of the things that happened to me, I was out in Australia a couple of years ago, and I was travelling around with a guy who was sort of a friend of a friend, and he was sort of a trainer for military cadets. And it was actually quite disturbing because we started talking about Full Metal Jacket, and he started reciting Robert Muchamore's dialogue. Now, the guy, but it wasn't just that he recited the bits of the dialogue. He could do the whole scene from the very start of the movie. And like, when you're sitting in the car and I'm thinking like, this has been going on for about 5 minutes now, when it's going to... And like, we were in the car for about... like, once you said like, oh, you can do... Oh, yeah, I can do the whole thing. And he just knew the entire script from memory. And it was the fact that he was also like an instructor for a bunch of cadets, you know. So clearly he was using these lines on these cadets who never seen the film and thought he was really clever coming up with all these great lines, you know.
Yeah, I do wonder if people do that. particularly when they're talking to kids who won't have seen the film.
Yeah. And I think, I definitely knew when I was writing Cherub, that you're writing a book for 11 and 12-year-olds, and there are certain things you can get away with. Adults will just say, oh, you're blatantly copying someone else, and that actually, if someone's 12, they haven't got a clue.
No, absolutely. You kind of... How significant for you is Full Metal Jacket in terms of war movies generally? Where does it sit for you in the sort of canon, I guess?
I guess it's quite crass to sort of come up with favourites and stuff like that, but it's almost certainly the war movie that I've watched most. I might say that Apocalypse Now is more interesting in a way, but it's also about 3.5 hours long, and it really drags in places. So, like Apocalypse Now, funny, we were just saying how, Full Metal Jacket is almost like it's got a really great bit and a really sort of above average, but competent would be a good word, bit at the second half of the film. And Apocalypse Now is just all over the place. there's bits that are just mind-numbingly dull. There are bits that are absolutely stunning. Apocalypse Now has probably got like the greatest opening of any movie ever. With they basically had the entire, I think it was Philippines Air Force to make this shot of them dropping real napalm on trees. And one of the things I always think when I watch that, I'm going completely off course on Full Metal Jacket.
It's all right, do it.
I always watch that, and I just watch it, and I just think how much more real and how much better it looks than anything I've seen in CGI. And there's just something about the rawness of it, the sound of the engines, the music, the flames going up, and there's something about these sort of CGI movies where it always somehow ends up looking exactly how you expect it's going to look. And I think that's something we've kind of lost a little bit in movies.
Yeah, I think let's say the companion to that is Christopher Nolan's Dunkirk from last year, which went a long way to doing things practically. Getting an IMAX camera in the cockpit of a Spitfire with Tom Hardy was, pretty incredible. The way some of the things they did there. And I guess that's kind of where the war movie is in a way, that it feels better the more practical and real it feels.
I think there is something about that. So I always use what I call a grounding technique, which sounds a bit pretentious, but when I write a Cherub book, people will say, why do you show kids going to sitting on the loo? Why do you say kids go for a shower? Why do they get muddy? And I think it's like about when you see a character in your head, if they're just a guy in a spangly suit dancing in front of a green screen, jumping from building to building, and that's all you ever see, you don't emphasise with them, so you kind of show the reality. I can emphasise much more with someone who comes home and moans about their day at work and stuff like that. And I just think you need to build a bit of reality into the situation.
You get someone like James Bond who's never been for a shit in his life.
Yeah, and James Bond, when you watch those early James Bond movies, and they were so unique because they were all about style over substance, and they were quite beautifully filmed. And I have a lot of admiration for sort of the first 2 or 3 James Bond movies, and I quite like Live and Let Die, actually, the 70s one. But after that, they're just sort of big and bloated, and you always know what's going to happen, and character isn't really very interesting. I'm never really big on James Bond. I'm always about halfway through a James Bond movie and I'm like, why am I watching this? They're always quite boring, really.
And I guess to bring it back to Full Metal Jacket, that's where the structure kind of helps, because you spend your first hour in quite a character-driven scenario, and then follow 2 or 3 of those characters into war.
I think the Matthew Modine character, the star, he's clearly the main character and does carry from one half to another. But really, the 2 most interesting characters, the instructor and the guy who ends up, I've forgotten his private pile, they disappear halfway through the movie, and that's so unusual, that you have a movie and halfway through, basically, your 2 most interesting characters disappear. Yes. I think once you've lost those 2, it's like, how do you replace those? And there are some really interesting characters in the second half of the movie, like there's some sort of pretty crazy soldiers, and the fact that the shooter at the end is sort of a little girl, and all this kind of stuff. But you're just never gonna be able to fill the movie once you kill off 2 characters that interesting.
Yeah, I think as I was watching it this morning, I kind of realised perhaps the reason the first half works so well for me is because it's essentially a horror movie, and I'm a big horror movie person, and so I think the best stuff that Kubrick's done, whether it's The Shining, whether it's certainly a lot of A Clockwork Orange is basically a horror movie, or the first half an hour of Full Metal Jacket, I think maybe that's where Kubrick's best for me, when he's doing horror cinema, but not horror cinema in a B-movie way, I guess, but horror cinema in a very prestige-y way. But yeah, so I guess the other question, I suppose, is you mentioned kind of having this love for Kubrick. aside from Full Metal Jacket, kind of what are your other favourite Kubrick moments or Kubrick movies?
I mean, probably A Clockwork Orange. I think partly it's because I grew up in the era when A Clockwork Orange was banned until Stanley Kubrick died. They wouldn't show it in the UK. And I can remember on one of my first ever trips to the USA when I was about sort of 19, 20 years old, one of my first tasks was to like go in a HMV store and buy a VHS copy of A Clockwork Orange. Because you've got to remember, in the pre-internet age, your only option was to buy a really dodgy copy on a market stall that was like recorded 10th hand and you could barely see what was going on. And, to watch the movie in any meaningful way, even at like VHS picture quality, the only way was to actually go to America and buy a copy over there. So I think there's that mystique around it. But I mean, again, I think it's just got the thing that Kubrick always does, which is plays against conventions, and like the fabulous scene where he's sort of, beating up a tramp while Singing in the Rain, and just all that kind of crazy stuff. And Tom can look across at my books on brutalist architecture. I love the fact that, Kubrick is one of the first people who really sees that kind of 1960s, 1970s stark brutalist concrete architecture, which at the time he was filming that was really quite new, and just kind of sees it as this kind of haunting, austere kind of thing. And I just think there's just so much fresh and so much original about it, and I think that's what's always nice about Kubrick's movies. You just kind of you look around every corner and you always see something interesting. I mean, a very different kind of filmmaker, but I think the closest thing to it that's working now is Wes Anderson, because although he makes very different movies, I'm always do the same thing, and you watch them sort of 2 or 3 times and you'll always see some new little detail or some weird thing that Bill Murray does in the background, or a little detail of a set, or and I think Kubrick kind of has a similar kind of thing.
It's that thing about being unmistakable, isn't it? So if you were to walk into a room where someone's watching a Wes Anderson film and you watched it for 30 seconds, you'd know who'd made that film.
Exactly, yeah.
And I think that's very much what Kubrick is as well. And maybe it comes down to what we've talked about with the sense of perfectionism.
Yeah, I mean, my favourite Kubrick perfectionism story is the one on The Clockwork Orange, where Dave Prowse is playing the carer for the disabled man. And apparently he made Dave Prowse do 6 retakes on the scene where he lifts up the disabled man in the wheelchair and carries him up a flight of stairs. I don't know if you remember that scene.
Yes, I do.
And apparently on the 7th retake, Dave Prowse just looked at Stanley Kubrick and said, "If you want to carry that man up a staircase in a wheelchair for the 7th time, you can do it," and just stormed off the set. It's just like, even if you're Dave Prowse and you're like the Darth Vader, the Green Cross Code Man, gigantic 6'7" bodybuilder, it's still really hard to carry a human being in a wheelchair up a flight of stairs. But Kubrick still wanted his 7th take.
Absolutely, anything to get that. I mean, you hear stories like that about David Fincher, don't you? Where he sits, with the Social Network, with the opening dialogue scene, he made them do something like 60 takes to make sure they got the exact rhythm and cadence of the dialogue right. But, in that vein, we talk about people like Kubrick and Fincher and Wes Anderson as being the best filmmakers. So, maybe putting your actors through hell is the way to get the film out.
It was this famous Alfred Hitchcock quote, "Actors are cattle," and I think it was Tippi Hedren who was the star of The Birds. I'm really going back in my film history here. And basically, I mean, she was just tormented. All those films where she had birds walking on her and pecking on her. And apparently she just had the most horrific time. And basically after filming The Birds, she was so traumatised and horrified by what an awful experience it was. She said she was never going to act again, and sort of asked Hitchcock, and he was like, "I don't really care, we got the shots."
That's sort of the way Hitchcock worked. It's very strange. So, you chose Full Metal Jacket. Were there any other films that you thought about, and kind of why did you consider those as potential?
Some quite different. I mean, the one that I always just love is Dazed and Confused, because although it's set in the 70s, it's got a great soundtrack. And I just remember seeing it, and it was at a time when I was sort of a youngish man and I'd not long left school, maybe 5 or 6 years. And although it was set in a different time period, I could really relate to it, and it made me feel quite nostalgic for sort of secondary school, not high school, because I'm British. And it's also just got a soundtrack and quirky. And again, it's got the kind of quirky characters. And I think it was one of the first indie movies. There's been quite a lot of them now, but at that time it felt very fresh and very different. And that's a movie, again, that when I'm a bit bored, or like if I'm feeling a bit under the weather and it's like a comfort movie, the sort of chicken soup movie, I'll just stick Dazed and Confused on. And then there's others, just classic. I mean, Groundhog Day would be another one I could talk about at great length, because it's just so small and neat and perfectly structured. And the other thing that I always think about when I think about Groundhog Day is it's like a 90-minute movie. and it's so perfect and there's so much in it. And then you go to the cinema now and you're watching one of these Marvel movies and it's like 153 minutes, and the last 50 minutes is a CGI sequence of person flies by, person flies this way, yellow person flies this way, red person flies this way, building blows up, another building blows up, and you're like, this is going to end at some point, surely, you know.
I was sat this week at one of the screenings for Ant-Man and the Wasp, the new Marvel movie, and I was like, I'm watching what is essentially a comedy movie about a man who can shrink to the size of an ant. It does not need to be 2 hours long with the best will in the world.
Yeah, I think movies are, you know, if a movie's over 2 hours, it's got to justify every single one of those extra minutes to me. I mean, you know, I'm not anti-long movies. You know, Lawrence of Arabia is about 4 hours or something. It's a great movie. You know, Spartacus is a great movie. You know, there are good long movies, but on the whole, you've really got to justify it. And most of the time these days, it's almost like, well, the CGI isn't that expensive. You know, we can be a bit slacky in the editing room. It's so easy these days to put a 140, 150 minute movie together.
And then you go back to something like Full Metal Jacket and you look at the way it looks, and it's a beautiful movie to look at.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't know if you were aware, I mean, I think most people know this, it's one of these sort of well-known trivia facts, but the sort of jungle stuff was filmed in London Docklands, because Kubrick was a bit sort of, not agoraphobic, he wouldn't not agoraphobic, that's when you won't go out, the one where you won't travel, and he didn't like travelling, and he wouldn't leave the UK, so the whole thing's filmed in London Docklands, and if you look at it, it's RAF Wessex helicopters and not American helicopters, and all the buildings are not actually like Vietnamese, they're actually sort of old English industrial style buildings, and the palm trees are all held together with glue, but it's actually really quite funny that he decided to shoot a Vietnam War movie in London Docklands, and of course in the part of London Docklands where you couldn't do it now because it's basically Canary Wharf, where it's all now massive tower blocks, and sort of 30 years later the environment isn't a bomb site after World War II, it's sort of the financial hub of Europe or something. You know?